Okay, our last talk before the panel is another policy talk. And today we have Beth Mendenhall, who earned her PhD in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University, where her dissertation focused on scientific and technological change in international regimes for the ocean and outer space. She's now an associate professor in the Department of Marine Affairs at URI, where she is also the graduate program director. Her current research focuses on the drivers and mechanisms of change in the global ocean governance regime. And I should mention, before she gets started, that in the early phases of the Twilight Zone project at WHOI, we were trying to think about and strategize about connecting to international policymakers and first educating them about the existence of the Twilight Zone, and then its importance. The work that Beth did with her colleagues in following the evolution of the BBNJ was instrumental and very helpful to us. So thank you, Beth.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Is this good? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, you covered a lot of the introduction. I don't have much to add, but I do want to emphasize that I'm a political scientist and my field is international relations. So I study how states interact with one another, including conflict, competition, collaboration, and when they're on their very best behavior, cooperation. So my training is in international relations, but my job is in a marine affairs department. So my specialization is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, the so-called Constitution for the Oceans, that for any part of the ocean, it tells you who can do what in that place. It assigns rights and duties and obligations to a particular zone. But UNCLOS is a great thing, but there's a lot to complain about also. There's a lot of dysfunction and ineffectiveness. And so my main focus is the drivers and mechanisms of change in the UNCLOS-centered ocean governance regime. So the BBNJ treaty was sort of a natural fit for me. And for the first several years of my position at URI, it was about a third to a half of my research portfolio at any given time. And I was lucky enough to attend all the negotiation sessions. So I start out by reminding you that international relations is my field because in IR, we tend to approach international law a lot different than international lawyers do. And so there's two things that I want you to keep in mind in terms of how I approach international law. The first is that what any treaty means is contested. It's worked out in practice among states as they interpret and implement a treaty. So these are photos of the UNCLOS negotiations and then the BBNJ negotiations that concluded in the BBNJ case earlier this year in March. And at the conclusion of those negotiations, it was settled what the treaty says in the 6 official languages of the United Nations. But what the treaty says is just a bunch of words. So what the treaty means remains to be seen at the implementation phase, which will actually be where the rubber meets the road in terms of interpretation. The second thing to keep in mind about an international relations perspective is we think about what the problem is quite differently. So probably everyone in this room agrees that there is a problem in terms of how humans are relating to the ocean. The ocean is being damaged in ways we don't like. We aren't protecting it in ways that we'd like to. And over the last couple of days, there's been a lot of emphasis on the aspects of the problem that include a transfer of knowledge. So the idea that policymakers just don't understand the science. They just don't understand the nature of the problem. There have also been a lot of references to the difficulties of international processes, which are opaque and convoluted, and kind of it's hard to get from where you want to be, from where you are now to where you want to be through these convoluted processes. International relations would emphasize a third key aspect of the so-called problem, the barrier to getting where we want to go, which is that states, by their very nature, pursue their national interests. And in the modern capitalist territorial state system, what states want is economic growth and strategic advantage. So there's a lot of talk about pursuing the common good, achieving public goods, And states are interested in that. A lot of times for domestic political reasons, they want to look pro-environment when the next election comes up. Also because the common good can also serve their national interest. But when it comes to public goods, those things that benefit everyone, no matter who paid the cost of achieving or creating that good, states have low incentives to pay those costs and make those sacrifices. So things like a clean and healthy and well-functioning marine ecosystem, that's a public good. And so it's not automatic that states are going to pursue those kinds of goals through their international cooperation and through their behavior regulating private actors under their control and jurisdiction. So just a reminder that the BB&J Treaty must be fully consistent with UNCLOS, but it's supposed to improve upon and move forward from UNCLOS, make UNCLOS more suited to the 21st century in terms of how we think about our goals and the ocean spaces that we're using. So the stated goal of the BB&J Treaty is the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. There are two types of spaces beyond national jurisdiction, and they're actually separate legal regimes. The light blue is the high seas beyond the exclusive economic zone. This is a kind of shared access, common access, everyone can use type of zone. The seafloor is called the area, capital A, area, the least creative name possible. I think of it as the international seabed. It's a separate legal regime from the high seas. And as this map demonstrates, the borders of the high seas, relatively clear, anything beyond 200 nautical miles. The borders of the area in many parts of the planet have yet to be determined because there's a large number of unresolved extended continental shelf claims made by coastal states. And so this isn't really like a key point for my talk. It's just very interesting, and I wanted you to know, because this treaty applies to areas beyond national jurisdiction, but it's still unclear where the boundaries of areas beyond national jurisdiction actually are when it comes to the seafloor. And so these areas where it's high seas above what might be an extended continental shelf, where a coastal state has sovereign rights over resources, will be particularly interesting and particularly complicated when you're trying to implement the BB&J Treaty. You probably already know that the BB&J Treaty covers 4 main issue areas. I think of the ones along the top as having to do with economic justice, the ones on the bottom having to do with environmental protection. So when we're talking about conservation, a lot of our focus is on area-based management tools in marine protected areas and environmental impact assessments. So in this talk, I'm going to focus a lot on the process for designating MPAs, marine protected areas, and the process for conducting environmental impact assessments, or EIAs. I'll talk briefly about the possibilities around the scientific and technical body, and then also briefly discuss the new restrictions or regulations around bioprospecting activities. And my main interest is outlining how the scientific community can and needs to drive the BB&J implementation process. And that's why I started with a reminder that states are pursuing their national interests. If we want to pursue other goals, shared goals, in a real and meaningful way, we need other actors like the scientific community to drive the process in particular directions. Themes you'll notice throughout is the implications of data deficiency in areas beyond national jurisdiction and the challenges involved when there is no centralized coordination, because the BB&J doesn't have a hierarchy over other instruments, frameworks, and bodies. It has to work in a very crowded governance landscape where there are lots of different options for pursuing different goals beyond national jurisdiction. So, a lot of text up here. This you can just let wash over you. There's a lot of different criteria that states can use when they are proposing a new MPA. So there's flexibility here and how you craft a particular proposal on the why question, why you should designate a particular area for protection. This is a state-driven process. So states forward particular proposals for particular MPAs. And then the process includes a review by the scientific and technical body, consultation with various stakeholders, and among the list of stakeholders, you see the scientific community. Then the states will go back after that review and consultation, revise that proposal, and then resubmit it to the Conference of Parties. The Conference of Parties is just a group of states that have ratified the BBNJ agreement. They ultimately decide which MPAs will get designated for special protection. The overall objective, or one of the overall objectives of this part of the BBNJ treaty, is not just to have one MPA at a time, but to create a network of ecologically representative and well-connected MPAs. But there's a problem in achieving this goal, because the MPA process is ad hoc. It's one at a time, it's case by case, it's what states choose to propose for protection. There's no centralized view where someone is saying, hey, we have MPAs that protect these kinds of areas, but we're sort of missing them in this kind of area. So the next proposal should cover, say, cultural factors and economic and social factors, because we don't have a lot there yet. The question of representation and well-connected is also not authoritatively defined at the BBNJ level. It's something that we want to achieve, but there's no centralized hierarchical watcher coordinating the process to make sure that that is something that we do achieve. And so we're in a situation where states are likely to propose MPAs that are easy to propose, perhaps because the data is already there, and that benefit them, maybe because they protect an area that's a habitat for fisheries that their long-distance fishers tend to exploit. Maybe it's an area that they think it would be strategic if they kept activities out of that area because they've got military bases nearby. So there's lots of other potential interests driving this process, and there's a lack of coordination to ensure that this is achieved. One major limitation, in my mind, throughout the BBNJ agreement, and this applies to the section on MPAs and also environmental impact assessments, is like all ocean governance treaties, starting with UNCLOS, the standard for decision-making is to use the best available scientific information and science. Best available, the best we've got. The dominant theme of this meeting is we don't have a lot of scientific information about a lot of things in the OTZ. And we know that that's true in other spaces and areas beyond national jurisdiction as well. The BBNJ agreement fundamentally takes a passive approach to scientific knowledge production. No part of the agreement mandates direct investment in scientific research. The standard is use the best available data that we've got and make decisions based on that. In terms of achieving this broader goal, one major issue is the geographical unevenness of data. And it's become very clear to me over the last 2 days that that evenness, I should be thinking about that in a horizontal sense, but also in a vertical sense. There are some places where it will be easier to put together an MPA proposal because we've done a lot of research there. And I think from an equity perspective, it's a really relevant question. Is it just and fair and good if we can have more MPAs in the North Atlantic because there's so much more research there than in the Indian Ocean or in the South Atlantic? This will have outcomes in terms of what MPAs we get first. I've already made these other 2 points, so for the sake of time, I'll move on to talk about the environmental impact assessment process. The EIA process in the BBNJ agreement was one of the more contentious areas that was settled later in the negotiations. What we ended up with was a 2-stage process. The first stage is to do a screening. The screening is to determine whether you need to do an EIA in the first place. And there's a lower standard for doing a screening in the event that there may be more than a minor or transitory effect on the marine environment, or if the effects of the activity are unknown or poorly understood, you have to do this screening step. And so a lot of activities that would potentially impact the OTZ will meet this standard, perhaps because of the unknown and poorly understood threshold. And so one sort of positive perspective on this screening threshold is this looks like the precautionary approach, right? If we don't know, then we should hold off and do more investigation. But if you go to the screening stage and it's determined after the screening that there are reasonable grounds that it may cause substantial pollution or significant harmful changes or damage to the marine environment, then you have to do an entire environmental impact assessment, which is a more involved process, as you might imagine. The issue is, if you get through this assessment and this community of scientists would still say those impacts are poorly understood, there's no requirement that states, if it's still relatively poorly understood, that they can't authorize that activity. This is, again, a state-driven process. It's ultimately the state that decides, after the environmental impact assessment is done, whether there's enough information to support it, whether we have the right information, and whether or not that all supports an authorization of that activity. I shouldn't be too doom and gloom about this process, though. There are novel elements of the DB&J Treaty that allow other states who are concerned about this to call for additional review, to call for the state to justify their decision. But there's no penalty or punishment or really strict requirement for the state to listen to those voices of third-party concerned states. Ultimately, the individual state that decides. And this is very common in international politics. States don't want to give up their sovereign ability to make decisions about what the private actors under their control and jurisdiction can do. So this is a relatively light form of international cooperation. It's a coordinated process with some obligations, but at the end of the day, it's the state that decides. Another major limitation of the DB&J Treaty that applies to both the MPA process and the EIA process is that from the outset, before the negotiations even began, participating states had agreed that this new treaty cannot undermine existing frameworks, instruments, and bodies that govern activities in the areas beyond national jurisdiction, like your International Whaling Commission, the International Seabed Authority, the International Maritime Organization, regional fisheries management organizations. The DB&J agreement does not have a hierarchy over any of these existing organizations or institutions. And what that means is when we're talking about things like the best available science standard or how you designate a marine protected area, we have to look beyond the DB&J process as well. Because we're in a situation where it's possible for states to engage in forum shopping. If you don't like the EIA process under the DB&J because the screening stage is too onerous, the DB&J Treaty allows states to use an equivalent EIA process under another instrument, framework, and body. And this is where I want to reach back to that point I made in the beginning, that what the treaty means is contested. So equivalent is not defined in the treaty. There's no authority that defines or evaluates equivalency. It's the state who says this is an equivalent process, so I want to do this process. And during the negotiations, there were other phrases considered, like comparably comprehensive or functionally equivalent. But those were also hard to define. And they implied that there was a particular standard with some authority behind it that could be evaluated, perhaps by the scientific and technical body. States weren't willing to agree to that. They just wanted to say, okay, well, if it's equivalent, that's enough. We know what equivalent is. We'll figure it out as we go. So for the EIA process, going back to that best available science standard, and we know that the available science and a lot of the OTZ probably isn't sufficient to evaluate the environmental impacts of new activities in this area. I would argue, and you'll see this Helm and Mendenhall 2023 hopefully soon, that there's a substantial risk of dysfunction in the EIA process. We've got two scenarios. Either environmental impact assessments are conducted with really low standards for scientific knowledge to support that EIA. So you don't have baseline data, maybe you don't really understand all the members of the community or how the ecosystem functions. Huge mistake to try and talk about science in front of a bunch of oceanographers. But anyway, if you have a low standard, then the EIAs will be relatively weak and activities will be authorized and we won't achieve the goal of conservation of biodiversity or sustainable use. We won't protect marine ecosystems. But if we maintain a really high standard and we say we need better scientific information than we have now, it'll take a really long time for EIAs to be completed and activities to be authorized. And from the perspective of states who are very caught up in the blue economy paradigm, I'll say, that is a dysfunctional EIA process as well, if activities are not being authorized in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But I would say that this first outcome is much more likely, given the best available science standard, given the lack of oversight and authoritative coordination. Scientific research and the scientific community can drive this process. So down here, oh, is there a pointer? Yeah, these things here are examples of types of information that you can sort of see in particular places in the BB&J Treaty. These are the kinds of things that we need to know in order to designate MPAs that are representative and well-connected in a network, and do EIAs that will achieve the goal of conservation and sustainable use. But that coherence, coordination, cooperation, it's not going to come from the BB&J institutions that are ultimately a collective of states pursuing their national interests. And so what we will need from the scientific community is to honestly characterize the terms in the treaty that are the standards that state activity is supposed to be held to. So what is a coherent network? What is a representative MPA? States and diplomats are not the authorities we want answering these questions. In terms of what scientific research that we do, the filling the geographical holes, like doing more research in the Indian Ocean and not doubling down on the research we have in the North Atlantic, that's not a decision that states are going to make. They're going to be thinking about the AB&J areas, the areas beyond national jurisdiction near their coast, and the ones that their long-distance fishers or the seabed mining companies that they're sponsoring, the areas of interest for their economic activity. So we want to fill these holes based on getting a synaptic understanding of marine ecosystems as opposed to based on serving the economic growth interests and strategic interests of states. That'll have to come from the scientific community. There is part of the institutional architecture of the BB&J where the scientific community could do this in a more direct way. The scientific and technical body will be established, well, it is established by the treaty, but it will begin to function once the treaty enters into force. And the scientific and technical body is assigned a lot of functions by this treaty. There's a lot of things that it is supposed to do. And actually, this is not an exhaustive list. This list was put together with reference to the MPA and EIA processes. But the scientific and technical body's main role is to make recommendations to the conference of parties. It has no decision-making functions assigned to it. However, there's some powerful functions in here that could create a normative standard by which state behavior is judged. So for example, the scientific and technical body is empowered to produce standards and guidelines for the EIA process. Now, during the negotiations, one of the offered options was global minimum standards and guidelines. The standards and guidelines for doing EIAs that would explicitly be used to evaluate and compare to other EIA processes. States weren't willing to agree to global minimum standards and guidelines, so we ended up with just standards and guidelines. But one example of something that could be really useful is developing specific standards and guidelines for EIAs conducted in particular parts of the ocean or particular activities. So create some nuance in terms of what scientific information is needed for an EIA in a particular place or for a particular activity. It's also the case that the Conference of Parties can assign the scientific and technical body additional functions. And so things, for example, like outlining the priorities for scientific data collection of marine ecosystems in the OTZ is something that theoretically the scientific and technical body could be doing. A lot of open-endedness and sort of flexibility about what could be achieved through this body. who's going to make up this body? It could be you. Hopefully it will be. This is all the treaty says, serving in their expert capacities. And this is actually pretty important phrasing. It means that the scientists on the scientific and technical body will not be representing a state and therefore representing that state's interests. They serve in their professional capacity. And there's supposed to be an effort to have multidisciplinary expertise and for the scientific and technical body to be networked with other scientists and experts outside of the BB&J process. Marine genetic resources. So this is my couple of slides on bioprospecting, and I apologize for only having images of seabed creatures. That was definitely an oversight on my part. So because the treaty has not entered into force, it is still accurate that currently there are no restrictions on collection of marine genetic resources for the purpose of utilization and commercialization, creating and selling products and making money. But in UNCLOS in the 70s, we decided that the international seabed is the common heritage of mankind. And finally, the BB&J Treaty has eliminated the unnecessary gendered language, and now we're going with common heritage of humankind. They're the same principle. And so the argument went that, hey, a lot of these marine genetic resources that we're interested in are on the seabed. We already decided the seabed belongs to everyone. So that standard or that approach should probably apply more broadly to marine genetic resources. And so what we have ended up with is in the treaty controls on access and a mechanism for sharing the benefits of using marine genetic resources. I want to point out, though, that this common heritage standard is relatively radical. 1 minute, great. No, I can do this. It's not protection of anything in the ocean for the ocean's own sake. It's a common property idea. So it's still, these are all resources that we own and we should use, but just as a collective, not as individual states. This is driven in part by the recognition by developing states that the utilization and commercialization of genetic resources thus far has been dominated by developed countries. And research universities were part of that conversation because the commercialization centers, or when scientists get hired from a research university into a pharmaceutical company, for example, and do different things with that marine genetic data, it's almost exclusively happening in the developed world. So this is an economic justice question. Skipping this. The BB&J Treaty includes these things. I don't think this is going to be that onerous on scientific research that collects genetic data through for DNA sampling. The reason being that your grant proposal process, grant reporting process already requires you to share a lot of this information. And so what we're likely to see is that when states ratify the treaty enters into force, they'll need to domesticate those requirements. I think they're very likely to do that through the requirements for their grants and their funding processes. All right, 2 more slides. Where are we now? So we adopted the treaty, which only means the negotiations are over. We have a treaty text. In 5 days, states can start signing and ratifying the treaty. Signature means nothing beyond a symbolic effect. It just means that the state is committed to trying to ratify the treaty, committed to not undermining the treaty. Ratification is the consent to be bound by the treaty. We need 60 states to do that through their domestic processes before the treaty enters into force. And then within a year, the Conference of Parties will form. Conference of Parties has to make a lot of decisions. And then the EIA and MPA processes I described can actually get going. This could take a while, and it matters who the first 60 states are. Because if it's anything like UNCLOS, they will be developing countries, and that will shape the implementation of the treaty. This is a basking shark. I just love it. A lot could happen when the Conference of Parties forms. There's a lot of decisions they need to make. The United States is very unlikely to ratify this treaty. I think it will still affect marine scientists based in the United States because historically the U.S. changes its domestic regulatory structure to be ready to ratify and also to enable you to collaborate with international partners who have ratified the treaty. So everything I've described will still apply to you even when Republicans in the Senate block ratification. This is me. I do a lot of other research. Look at my website if you're interested. If you're thinking about marine policy, we've got 2 master's programs and a PhD. Come talk to me. URI is just down the road. It's also beautiful there.